Здравствуйте, everyone, and welcome to episode 4 of History with the Drywaller. In this episode, we're going to be continuing our look at the Soviet Union that we began last time, but today we're going to continue to lay the groundwork for those episodes with a look at the life and career, so to speak, of Nicholas II, Tsar of Russia. Now, Nicholas II was not a great Tsar, but why he wasn't a great Tsar has a lot to do with the Tsars that came before him. So I'd like to take a second to run you through the two men who paved the way for the reign of Nicholas II. The first of these men, of course, being Alexander II, which was Nicholas's grandfather. Now, Alexander II is known as the Tsar Liberator, and that is simply because he was, as far as Tsars go, very liberal and presided over a broad spectrum of reforms meant to bring Russia into the modern world. Among these reforms were a reform of the judicial system, the abolition of corporal punishment. He established local representative government in the provinces. He promoted wider education, and he freed Russia's serfs from their feudal bondage, thus the Tsar Liberator. Also, as an interesting side note, he's the Tsar who sold Alaska to the Americans. Now, unfortunately, his liberating tendencies did not endear him to everyone, and he ended up on the bad side of a very nasty group of people known as the People's Will. And the People's Will made their displeasure with the Tsar known by blowing him up and killing him in a terrorist attack. Now, Alexander II was succeeded by Alexander III, who witnessed his father's murder, and as you can imagine, that did not endear him to either the people or to his father's liberal reforms. Alexander III was an arch-aristocrat, an arch-autocrat, and an arch-reactionary. He cracked down on the People's Will, essentially exterminating them through the use of the Okhrana secret police. And as another interesting aside, one of the men who would be executed as a member of the People's Will is a man named Alexander Ulyanov, who is the older brother of a man named Vladimir Ulyanov, who would launch his own revolutionary career that would eventually lead him to the head of the Bolshevik party and taking the much more famous nickname of Vladimir Lenin. But getting back to Alexander III, he proceeded to reverse or reduce most of the reforms of his father, blaming these reforms for his father's death. And among these reversals and reactionary policies was a increased anti-Semitism, a restriction of Jews to living in certain areas, a restriction of Jews attending universities. This was not going to be a happy time to be Jewish. And making the situation even worse, Alexander III deeply, deeply believed in absolute power and absolute autocracy. He believed that it was his God-given duty to perform his functions as the absolute Tsar of Russia, and he would pass on this belief to his son, Nicholas II. Now, Nicholas was born in 1868, and he ascended to the throne in the year 1896. And in true Nicholas II fashion, even his coronation party was a disaster. There were way more people in attendance than had been planned. There were way less security than there were supposed to be. And to make matters worse, rumors were swirling that great cash prizes and treasures were being given away and that there weren't going to be enough for everyone. This led to a human stampede as everyone tried to get up to the gift registry area as fast as they could. In this human stampede, almost 1,400 people were killed. Now, this would be bad enough for, among other reasons, the staggering loss of life, but Nicholas II was persuaded to attend a gala with the French ambassador the very night that this disaster took place, immediately giving his people the impression that he wasn't very worried about their deaths. So, having kicked off his reign on a high note, we now have to address something that started in the reign of his father and was ramped up and made much worse in the reign of Nicholas Nicholas II, and that is the anti-Semitism again. Now, throughout Nicholas's reign, his Minister of the Interior was directly funding anti-Semitic newspapers with Nicholas II's full knowledge. And in 1903, these newspapers would claim that these Jews were murdering Russian and Ukrainian children in order to do blood sacrifices and all this sort of nonsense. Unfortunately, in the history of anti-Semitism, these sorts of claims are not uncommon. And these wild claims in the state-funded newspaper would lead to hideous anti-Jewish riots and pogroms in 1903. 49 Jews would be killed, 92 people were seriously wounded, and an uncounted number of Jewish women were assaulted. 700 Jewish homes were destroyed, and 600 Jewish businesses were pillaged. Unfortunately for the Jews and for humanity, I would say, Nicholas II was not distressed by these pogroms. In fact, he expressed admiration for the anti-Semitic mobs who had committed these attacks. Yeah, we're really doing great so far. And continuing with his pattern of being a nasty racist snob, Nicholas would engage in downright dismissive and racist diplomacy with the Japanese over some territory they were disputing in Manchuria. Nicholas wouldn't respond to their entreaties on time. He wouldn't respect their ambassadors. He was just being a bully for no reason, because he did not view the Japanese as his equals. Now, this would come back to bite him in the very next year, 1904, because the Japanese got sick of his diplomatic merry-go-round and launched a surprise attack on the Russian port of Port Arthur. And they took it after besieging it for 9 months and destroying the Russian Pacific Fleet in the process. Now, Nicholas refused to believe that the Japanese were not, as he often called them, inferior little monkeys, so he decided that it would be a good idea to send the Baltic Fleet from the Baltic Sea, just off the Atlantic, all the way around the world to fight the Japanese. Now, this sailing adventure by the Baltic Fleet is one of the most famous episodes in naval history. It's called, I believe, The Voyage of the Damned, and it involves iconoclastic monkeys, snakes that take over ships. At one point, the Russians fired on some British fishing vessels thinking that they were Japanese. This was a wild disaster. But eventually, it did reach Japan, and it was almost immediately annihilated at the Battle of the Tsushima Straits in 1905. And that basically ended any hope the Russians had for anything resembling a victory, and the Russians would sue for peace in September of 1905. But unfortunately, the people were not willing to put up with it even for as long as it took peace to arrive. On the 9th of January, 1905, a march of workers went to the Winter Palace, headed by a very devout priest named Father Gapon, where they intended to deliver a petition to Tsar Nicholas about the hideous working conditions that had in part been exacerbated by the war in the East. Now, it's important to keep in mind that these petitioners deeply revered the Tsar. They brought icons with him. They sang "God Save the Tsar." They thought that he was their benevolent savior. He wasn't. He wasn't even around and had no intention of meeting with these petitioners, and while he was unaround, his soldiers around the Winter Palace would open fire on the crowd, killing 92 people and wounding several hundred. That leader that I mentioned earlier, Father Gapon, who began the march truly believing that the Tsar was going to save him and solve all his problems, he wrote this right after the march was over. "Nicholas Romanov, former Tsar and at present sole murderer of the Russian Empire. The innocent blood of workers, their wives and children lies forever between you and the Russian people. May all the blood which must be spilled fall upon you, you hangman." So, yeah, this situation is not getting better anytime soon. This episode would be called Bloody Sunday, and it would lead almost immediately to what's called the Revolution of 1905, which was a widespread series of mutinies, attacks, and revolts, which included, but was not limited to, the killing of Nicholas's uncle, Grand Duke Sergei, the mutiny and attempted scuttling of the battleship Potemkin, which would be made very famous by the movie of the same name, and the paralyzing nationwide worker strike strikes that occurred all through 1905. This led to a panicked Nicholas calling a Russian parliament, which in Russian is called the Duma, which turned out to be very liberal, so Nicholas dissolved it. Nicholas would then call a second Duma, and the representatives that were elected to that Duma also turned out to be very liberal, so he dissolved it too. He would then radically change the election laws, making sure that only essentially landed aristocrats could vote, and after that, a third Duma was elected, and it turned out to be very pliant and conservative and more than willing to work with him on just about anything. Now, while all this is going from bad to worse in the public sphere, privately, Nicholas had, after quite a bit of trying and many daughters, had finally had a son. And of course, in these old societies, the son is the only one that could inherit. So having a son was a very big deal. Unfortunately for the Romanovs, Tsarevich Alexei, who was the crown prince, was a hemophiliac. This was not uncommon in the royal families throughout Europe. They were all, after all, related to each other, and this disease sort of seems to be passed around like a white elephant gift. But as far as him being the heir to the throne, being a hemophiliac was kind of a problem, and it led to constant stress and terror and worry by both Nicholas and his wife Alexandra. And this terror and desperation would lead directly to an introduction to a man named Grigory Rasputin, who was an illiterate faith healer in Siberia. The family would be introduced to him in 1906, and that brings us to Rasputin. Now, there's a lot of popular myth and intrigue that surrounds the life and times of Grigory Rasputin, and unfortunately, I'm going to have to dispel that very quickly. Essentially, what Rasputin was he was a prophet and a faith healer who made some grand claims and some grand predictions, got lucky, and then rode the fame from those lucky predictions straight to the doorstep of the desperate Tsar and Tsarina, and tried to leverage his alleged powers of healing into a position of wealth and prominence in the imperial court. I haven't seen much evidence that he actually had much influence over the day-to-day running of the empire, but he clearly had a lot of influence over the Tsar and the Tsar's wife. How this manifested in the actual running of the Russian Empire, I'm not totally sure, but it was perceived by the Russian people that whenever something went wrong, it must be Rasputin pulling the strings behind the scene. And this would lead directly, just to skip ahead a bit, to Rasputin being murdered in December of 1916. There's a lot of popular myth about how people tried to poison him and he couldn't be poisoned and they shot him and none of that is true. His autopsy exists and has been recorded, and he was shot in the head and dumped in the river. There was no poison in his system. He didn't drown. He was invited to a dinner and he was ambushed, and they shot him in the head and threw him in the river. And that is the end of Grigory Rasputin. But that does bring us to the First World War in 1914. Now, the First World War is a huge deal and had a massive impact on the entire structure of Europe. But we are going to do our best to cover it in brief because the twists and turns aren't super critical to our story as it stands now. The important thing to keep in mind is the Russians under Nicholas's first cousin, Grand Duke Nicholas, who was the commander of the Russian armies at the time, they didn't do very well. They were annihilated at the Battle of Tannenberg and would continue to be crushed and harried and pushed back by the Germans. The Tsar responded to these initial defeats by essentially scapegoating his first cousin, or I should say first cousin once removed, Grand Duke Nicholas. The Tsar Nicholas II scapegoated him and blamed him for all the disasters. Following this, the Tsar took personal command of the Russian military, which seemed like a good idea, except now, as the Russians continue to lose, there's no one to blame because the Tsar very publicly took full responsibility for the enacting of the war. And the Russians would continue to lose. They had a hard time supplying their men. They couldn't sustain this level of total war. Their infrastructure was way behind. They were continuously defeated and pushed back. And on the 23rd of February in 1917, the lack of supplies in Petrograd, specifically the lack of food, food in Petrograd led to a series of riots and increasingly violent protests. The police, not being equipped to handle this, tried to stave off the violence by sniping people from the rooftops, which, as you can imagine, did not make anyone less angry. Soldiers were sent from various garrisons around Petrograd, but they very quickly sided with the rioters. They would fire into the air rather than firing on the crowd as they were ordered, and at least one officer was immediately shot by his men after he ordered them to fire into the crowd. By the 12th of March, 1917, almost all the soldiers around Petrograd had mutinied and joined the growing revolution, including the Preobrazhensky Regiment, which were the elite guards of the Tsar, founded by Peter the Great himself. So this is pretty much it. The Duma and the Petrograd Soviet, which, by the way, Soviet is just Russian for council. It was essentially a council of workers. The Duma and the Soviet would form a provisional government, and they would call for the Tsar's abdication. Nicholas would abdicate, at first in favor of his brother, Grand Duke Michael, but Grand Duke Michael could see where this all was going and refused. So that was the end of 300 years of Romanov rule in Russia. The Tsar would abdicate, no one would take the throne, and power would transition to the provisional government of the Duma and the Petrograd Soviet. To close out the story of Nicholas II, he did not have any more political influence after this time. He would be taken into custody and moved around through different safe houses in Siberia. After the beginning of the Russian Civil War, there was some concern that the anti-Bolshevik whites would find him and try to reinstate him as the Tsar, so the Tsar and his entire family would end up being shot and bayoneted in a basement in Yekaterinburg in Siberia. This is seen as quite a tragedy in modern Russia. As you can imagine, killing of the whole royal family and their staff is quite a traumatizing thing for a nation, and they were all killed. Much like Rasputin, there are many conspiracy theories going around that one of the daughters, or maybe Alexei, managed to escape, and no, the grave was discovered in the late 90s, early 2000s, and by 2007, all of the Romanov family had been accounted for. Their DNA was a match. They were all killed in that basement. Nicholas would later be canonized as a saint by the Eastern Orthodox Church amid, as you can imagine, a lot of criticism given what a committed anti-Semite he was, but that was the end of the Romanov ruling family. Which brings us to the end of our podcast for today. Next time, we will continue with our exploration of the USSR by looking at the next big name in the development of the Soviet Union, and that is Vladimir Ulyanov, or Vladimir Lenin. I'll see you then.